Another mass shooting in the U.S. 10 people have been killed in L.A. near a Chinese lunar celebration event. What has become a staple of life in America, it appears. And the question still remains, why does America tolerate mass shootings that are taking place due to firearm possessions? In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at this recurring crisis there and what role the gun lobby, the NRA, has, along with why U.S. politicians and the U.S. President himself have failed to stop this phenomenon. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the program. Richard Becker, an anti-war activist from Answer Coalition, joins us from San Francisco. Also joining us, Margaret Kimberly, co-founder of the Black Agenda Report, who joins us from New York. Welcome to you both. Another sad day for the U.S. when it comes to mass shootings there, Richard Becker. 10 dead in gun violence near the Chinese Lunar Year celebrations. And the way that this was described was a shooter with a machine gun carrying a large number of rounds, or carrying a number of rounds of ammunition so that he could reload, is how he was cited during action. What is your initial reaction to this?
Well, it's horrific. It's just horrific. And, you know, we've seen the mass killings now in Uvalde, in Buffalo, very near where I was from originally, but all over the country. And it's true that I think there's been 30 already in this year, in 2023. And, you know, it's a, you also have to think when we hear this is the latest reports, when we see these terrible casualties and the injuries of those who survive, life-changing injuries in many cases. And you know, immediately what I was thinking today was thinking back to 2005 when George W. Bush passed a law that was called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And what it did was basically say that the arms makers are exempt. They are protected by the federal government from being having any responsibility for what their products are used for. And there's no doubt that they know what their products are being used for, because the huge number of weapons that are being produced and sold inside of the United States are bound to end in like what we've seen again today. And the U.S. government has protected, it has carved out protections. It is carved out protections for the arms makers. It's carved out protection from criminal liability or going to jail for any of those responsible for the opioid crisis. It protects the rich and the big corporate interests, and then says that, you know, the leaders come back and talk about, you know, people who have suffered these losses and these tragedies are in our thoughts and prayers. I mean, it's the cynicism is incredible.
Okay, since you talked about the number of arms being produced, or guns being produced, I have to then go to that stat, because stats speak for themselves. So, Margaret Kimberly, the gun ownership in the U.S., it says, based on the latest, that the U.S. ratio of 120.5 firearms per 100 residents, which is up from 88 per 100 from the year 2011. But then more interestingly was when the NRA, based on a simple Google search, which is that National Rifle Association, in information related to that, it said that the number of privately owned firearms has more than doubled from about 192 million to more than 405 million. 405 million, including more than 167 million handguns. Okay, so there's money in it, there's profits that are being made, but the fact that these gun manufacturers are exempt from accountability, they have to be protected. Are we looking at the NRA being that modem or that channel for their protection?
Well, you know, they're not the only corporate interests that are protected from any liability. Vaccine makers are protected from liability. Airlines have great protection from liability. They don't even have to protect the country when they don't schedule flights and cancel flights. So it's part of what's happening in this country where corporate interests are in control. We have an oligarchy in this country, so it could be the NRA, it could be big pharma, it could be any number of entities. But the big problem here goes back to the beginnings of American history. This is a settler colonial state, and this mentality that this is a country to be conquered, that other people excuse me, are to be subjugated is one that still resonates with millions of people. I also think that as this country is a failed state, that is the hard truth of the matter. As conditions, living conditions for people deteriorate, as people become more and more insecure economically, I believe those people who are uh, frail psychologically are inspired to act on their worst impulses. And I think every incident leads to another. These people who need help inspire one another. So when there's one mass shooting, another generally follows fairly quickly. And so I think this combination of this mentality that says it's okay to be violent, it's beneficial to be violent, and you can't separate the domestic from the international. You can't have a country with a huge military budget which claims the right to kill people all around the world. You cannot be surprised when individuals feel like they have the right to kill when they want to.
Okay. I'm interested in your, you mentioned psychological problems. I'm interested as to why you chose that to being one of the factors for what you just said.
Well, I think it's obvious. There are people, many people in this country who are just unhinged, who are to, it's not a technical term, who are out of their minds. And I think the combination of the deterioration in life, for example, there are fewer and fewer living wage jobs. The safety net that we have is always threatened. People can't count on work. They can't count on having the ability to care for themselves. There's more and more insecurity. And I think when you combine that with people who, I mean, and they always exist, do they not? People who need mental health care. And then you combine that with this country that's historically been very violent and where the political system protects this type of violence and others. These people now are, I believe, inspired. And when you
Okay.
don't handle it, when there was no crackdown, then of course each one inspires the next.
All right. So let's dive into that issue if we can, because it's pretty shocking, Richard Becker, what our guests there touched on when it comes to the number of deaths overall, which needs to be mentioned here. We're looking at 40,000 roughly, or between 40 to 45,000 that are dying every year in the U.S. because of firearms in one form or another, which translates into more than 110 Americans that die every day. Okay, but what's very shocking and at the same time very interesting, but more shocking than that, is with the breakdown. When you take a look at the breakdown, you have a little over 19,000 based on the homicides that happen, but 24,000, which is more than homicides, is because of suicides. That's pretty shocking. I mean, I don't know if many people are aware of that. They know that U.S. is a dangerous place, and of course firearms is a problem that the U.S. has, but not many people, I think, are aware that it's because of suicides. Are the reasons given, first of all, what do you think of that? Are the reasons given there by our guest, Margaret, reasons for people to take their lives? And what does that say about the state of mental health of many Americans in the U.S.?
Well, yes, I completely agree with what Ms. Kimberly said. And you know, we live in a very atomized society. People are on their own. And if you're lucky and, you know, you have a good income and, you know, your family has stability and so forth, you know, still you can run into a lot of problems. But if you don't have those things, and particularly if you don't have income, if you become
Richard Becker, I think we lost you. Okay, let me go to you, Margaret Kimberly. Yeah, we lost Richard Becker there, temporarily, I hope. Margaret Kimberly, so this is, now on this issue, Margaret Kimberly, are you with us? We've lost both of our guests. While they look for reconnection with our guests in our technical team, let me review some of the facts that we just covered in terms of what we were just talking about. First of all, in terms of the number of deaths that have happened based on the daily amounts, 110 is what I mentioned. The deaths, however, on a daily basis is 45,000. So 45,000 Americans, based on the record that we have, the last year on record based on our research was the year 2020. That figure, as I mentioned to our guests there, was a 25% increase from even 5 years ago, and a 43% increase if you want to go back all the way to the year 2010. So there you have the number of deaths that happen based on firearms. And that is very shocking, given the breakdown that I just talked about, which is what we were just about to get into with our guest, which we covered a little bit, in which you have suicides that contribute more than actual homicides when it comes to the number of deaths by firearms. So the amounts of Americans dying based on suicides is very shocking. Our guest there talked about how the suicides are a result of basic economic factors that contribute to that. So you can see that America is not the utopia that many advocate or talk about. Of course, every country does have, I'm sure, people who perhaps in one way or another take their life because of their economic problems. Okay, so we have Kimberly back, Margaret Kimberly. Margaret Kimberly, we were talking about this shocking stat about the suicides, which you touched on. Now, based on what we're looking at, there are pros and cons on this. Advocates for these stricter gun laws say that, you know, you need to have lawmakers devoting some resources for people in order to prevent them from taking their lives with firearms. At the same time, you have gun control opponents who have framed the gun violence as a symptom of a broader mental health problem, which obviously shows that they say there's a crisis there, and it's not, the life being taken away is not due to the firearm, it's due to the person. What would you say to them?
Well, I think it's both. You know, we have these people have easy access to these guns with large magazines, which can fire many bullets, which no one, I believe, has any reason to own. There's no reason. These are military grade weapons, and anyone can get their hands on them when there's no justification for it. Now, the opponents of gun control will say that they may be a marksman, or it's target shooting or hunting, or I don't understand why, though, these cannot be regulated. But the NRA, an organization I do not support at all, has a lot of support around the country. So I think it's a combination of two things. The statistic you gave about how many gun fatalities are caused by suicides is a huge number.
Right.
And I think, to the point I was making before, that's something that isn't talked about very much, the suicides that happen with guns. But as the other guest said, we have this atomized society, people on their own, worsening economic conditions, a political system that does not address the needs of the people, but only addresses the needs of the oligarchy. All of these things combine to create a kind of thinking among millions of people, people who see other people as their enemy, people who don't see any common cause with others, and then may have some mental health problem. And then, of course, when it's not taken care of, when nothing changes, each act inspires the next one. So, I hate to say this, but it's inevitable that we're going to have these mass shootings until something changes. But we live in a society where the system doesn't help the people in so many other ways. So we should not be surprised about this either.
Okay, we have Richard Becker back with us also. Richard Becker, when you had that school shooting that happened in Texas that left 19 children dead and 2 adults also as part of that, basically 21 people to have been killed, It was very, how can I say, it's very telling what the US President Joe Biden said when he said, or posed as a question when he said, when are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? What does that say about the gun lobby?
Well, the gun lobby is quite powerful. I mean, many politicians have received $1 million or multi-million dollar donations over the years. Mitt Romney, who's considered one of the moderate Republicans, I think is the leader with more than $13 million in donations from the gun lobby. And it's very true that the huge number of weapons are already dispersed in the population. Um, and in order to begin to halt this, there has to be consequences for the gun makers. And and there haven't been. When the opioid makers like Purdue Pharmacy would send a million opioid pills to a town of 300 people, they didn't think that somehow those were all going to be used for pain purposes, or that there were going to be those kind of health problems in that town that required that number. No, they knew that this was going to go into the market, into the illegal market, to the black market, and become immensely powerful and immensely profitable. And it did. And the same thing goes for the weapons makers. They know that these guns that are being distributed in such vast quantities throughout the United States, and such an increase in the number of guns in circulation domestically, that's going to mean more mass shootings, more mass killings. But they are protected. They are protected the same way that, as Margaret Kimberly mentioned, so many other industries are, so many other capitalist industries are.
Okay, the question of accessibility is very important over here. Now, some thought when Joe Biden signed that historic law that's said to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest, gun control laws last year, was going to somehow put a dent into what has occurred in terms of mass shootings or firearms, deaths as a result of firearms, but that did not happen. So, they're asking for some of the proposals: stricter gun control laws, universal background checks to be stronger, or banning certain types of weapons. Okay, these all sound good, but they haven't worked, even though there's been strides made in it. But the question of accessibility, I think, is the bigger problem. And Margaret Kimberly, I don't know what part of New York you are at, but I'm sure you're familiar with the Bronx. And I'm going to just name an example. Co-op City in the Bronx. And this is a real example of the way guns are accessible. Co-op City in the Bronx, one of the streets that is not even in a very bad neighborhood. You have people that are just hanging out, and you can go to them and say, "What's up?" They say, "What do you need?" And if you say you need a handgun, they come back and tell you, "We'll have it for you within the hour." Okay, that's the reality of what's going on in the streets. How can that then be stopped? I mean, what can the police do? Because it goes back to the streets and the U.S. being awash with guns. So there needs to be a breaking point there. How can that be addressed?
Well, it's interesting. I'm in New York City. It's interesting you mentioned New York. Handgun laws vary by state, and New York State has very strict gun laws, except guns come from other states that aren't very far away. So if you go, I don't know, drive 4 or 5 hours away to Virginia, which has very loose gun regulations, almost none, that is where people get guns and then bring them back to New York
What
and
do you
to
mean
other
none? I'm
states
sorry to jump in. Why loose and why none? That doesn't make sense,
because
does it?
people and not doesn't make sense to me, but there are people across the country who they don't want gun regulations. This is something where there is a divide, a popular divide, and there are places where people believe in their right to bear arms, as they call it, their right to own firearms, as powerful as they want, as many as they want. And the people who own guns actually own a lot of guns, which is why there's so many per person, at least one per person. So you have people in these states, people run for office promising not to enact gun legislation. So you have part of the population who are quite happy not to have any regulations, but their decisions impact those of us, like in New York, who do want gun regulation. So people can come to New York City, to the Bronx, to Brooklyn, to any part of the city with guns from other places, and they can do with them whatever they choose. So even in a state which has stricter laws, handguns are still very easily accessible, even though that access is not legal.
So is that the case, Richard Becker? I mean, based on your viewpoint, that I don't know what this is like in San Francisco, but that you can maybe travel outside of San Francisco, maybe go to some part of LA, maybe go to I don't know projects where the guns might be available there on the streets readily if you were to peruse the neighborhood, and for the right price get one. Is that how it stands? Because you two are at the opposite end of the U.S., one in the east, one in the west.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm from upstate New York, western part of New York State. I haven't lived there in a long time, but I knew a lot of people. I didn't do hunting myself, but I knew a lot of people who were hunters. You don't go hunting with a semi-automatic rifle or a handgun. That's illegal to do. That's not what it's for. So you have to ask, well, what is it for? What are they producing? What is and a lot of the gun industry, by the way, is based in Connecticut. A lot, and they're very powerful in Connecticut politics, and so they're shipping out all these weapons that supposedly have some good purpose for them, or healthy purpose, and they know they're not. They really know that. In as far as California goes, San Francisco, okay, San Francisco probably has less guns per capita than the average city. I'm pretty sure it does. But there are gun shows. There's not only gun dealers, there's gun shows. You can go to Walmart and get guns, and gun shows happen. And one of the things that the gun lobby has resisted is having strict background checks at gun shows, where there'll be like hundreds of gun makers or gun dealers, not the makers but the dealers more, in like a big place like a convention center. And people go around, they look at them, and they buy them, and there can be some background checks, but it's very, very loose and easy to avoid any limitations on your ability to gain weapons, either in the black market, either illegally or legally.
Even politicians have not been immune to this, Margaret Kimberly. I was looking down a list of U.S. Congress members killed or wounded in office, and I'm quite surprised that it goes all the way back to the year 1789. I'm not going to rehash all the different congressmen, which is broken down by their party affiliation. However, what comes to mind is when Reagan, for example, was shot, or you have other instances of U.S. politicians that are not immune from guns, and yet the U.S. is still looking at this being a problem. So where do you go from here? I mean, here's another mass shooting, 10 people to have been killed. I'm sorry to say, I think it's going to happen again, and I'm sure that's what people in the administration are telling each other. But then what are they going to do about it?
Well, it's interesting you quoted President Biden, who said, "When are we going to do something?" as if he has nothing to do with what sort of legislation is passed in the country as president. But he knows, having been in politics for decades, he knows that there's a lot of support for
Right.
the right to own any gun you want, as powerful as you want. He knows it would be tough
Okay.
politically to do,
Sorry
and
to
that's
jump in.
why he
Sorry to
and
jump in,
others
Margaret Kimberly.
evade responsibility.
My bad. We were just out of time. I did not note the time there, but I do apologize. Margaret Kimberly, co-founder of the Black Agenda Report. Thank you. Anyways, Richard Becker, thank you. Anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kaveh Tafway, and the team, it's goodbye.